Rameshbabu Praggnanandhaa from India is a 16-year-old chess prodigy playing in the Tata Steel Masters, the first time he's played in a Super GM tournament, and in round 7 he was playing none other than world champion Magnus Carlsen. So it's always fascinating when you see the young up-and-coming stars playing against the old guard, the established big dogs like Magnus. So let's see what happened here. And if you love a daily chess video, do hit subscribe to never miss a future one. So Pragg started off with the white pieces here, going in for a Queen's Gambit. Magnus plays the Queen's Gambit declined, but after knight f3, he goes in for the Queen's Gambit accepted. An interesting move order piece. Maybe he didn't want e4 straight away when he hadn't yet played pawn to e6. Now if e4, he has some bishop b4 ideas in certain lines. So okay, we now had pawn to e3 instead of e4. a6 from Magnus. Bishop takes here. This is all pretty standard opening stuff. And after this development here, we had pawn to c5. Now there are various points at which white can play a4 here to clamp down on b5. But Pragg goes for a different pawn structure as we see with pawn to b3. And sometimes you see these pet moves, they can carry actually a lot of venom if you don't quite know what you're doing. So Magnus goes pawn to b6 actually, instead of committing with b5. Both players just looking for a game of chess here, feeling their way into the position. And bishop a3 is a nice developing move, not coming to b2. So you pressure here, and you discourage black from playing pawn takes on d4. That is actually technically playable, but you lose your castling rights if you were to do that. And now Magnus develops with the knight d7. If you get too casual with bishop b7, well now this is a bad pawn structure for black. You could have a line like this. Taking the queen wasn't forced, but okay, you could have something like this. White has the open d-file and the better pawn structure, not what you want. So Magnus doesn't misstep with bishop to b7. He plays knight b to d7, but this does allow white to kick on with pawn to d5 now. And after takes, bishop recaptures, hitting the rook. You don't want to be taking here, which looks quite natural to pick up the bishop pair, because after the queen recaptures, rook to b8, this bishop can now slide back to b2. And black just has a really hard time finishing the development on the king side here, as we can see. Not a nice position. So Magnus doesn't go for this. After the bishop comes into d5, he plays rook to b8 immediately. And now bishop b2 anyway. That bishop's job is done. There's no more tension here in the centre. So it hits this lovely long diagonal. We had bishop e7 from Magnus, knight to c3, castles from black, queen to c2, connecting the rooks, preparing to bring one to the d-file here. And now b5 from Magnus, so he gets on with that queenside expansion, which is standard in these structures. And here, this is where Pragg just loses his way slightly. So he wants to bring a rook to the d-file, but he plays rook f to d1. And the reason why this isn't quite as strong as rook a to d1 is that really you want to keep this rook on the king side here, connected with central play or even king side attacks later. Because when you actually look at the white pieces, they're all pointing at the king side here, as we can see. This bishop, the knight can jump in soon, this knight to g5. All of white's attention is directed in that direction, and so that's really what Pragg's plan should be centered around. But in the game, he goes rook f to d1, leaving this one here, because after queen to c7, he plays pawn to a4. This is his idea, to expand on the queen side. But it's just not the right plan, because that's where Magnus is looking to play. Instead, he had a really powerful move here, knight to g5, going for the throat of the king. And after, say, a move like pawn to h6, now the knight can drop back into e4. And this is really dodgy for Magnus, very dangerous position for black. If you take either of these two pieces, then the knight is coming in with really devastating effect, opening up the bishop. And so you can't really play like this as black. You'd have to go rook to d8 or knight to b6. But it's a very nice position for white, as we can see. All of these central pieces very actively placed. But Pragg missed to play like this with knight to g5. And instead he went pawn to a4, just missing the thread. Now Magnus could go b4 immediately, but instead he plays pawn to h6, just not wanting to allow any of that nonsense. He probably saw after queen c7, oh crap, I could be in some trouble here. So now we had pawn captures here from Pragg, the pawn recaptured, and queen to e2, again, another sign that he's just misstepping now. So Magnus plays queen b6, which is a square you're happy to sit your queen on anyway. And now again, it's just hard to play for white. One of the top computer lines is actually bringing the queen back to c2 to look in this direction again. So Pragg instead plays pawn to e4, wanting to keep the momentum, keep the pieces moving forward. But I really don't like this move. You block the knight ever coming here. The bishop is sort of lodged now on d5, which might look nice, okay, but it blocks the knight from ever sitting there. And then the knight blocks the bishop from opening up. Plus this e-pawn could be a target now, as we'll see. So rook e8 immediately pressures that one. Queen to d2 now from Pragg, so more queen movement here, not ideal. And after bishop f8, this pawn's under some big pressure because b4 is threatened. So that's why queen f4 to hold this pawn. Now when b4 comes and the knight moves, then at least this pawn isn't dropping immediately. But look at this knight now. A really sorry state of affairs because it's way out on the edge of the board. A knight on the rim is dim, as they say. It can't come back here. The bishop blocks b2. There's no way to come in here. Now it's hitting the queen, but a nice tactical sequence from Magnus. So he takes on d5 first. Now you can't go in for this as white because after takes here, takes on d7, bishop captures, rook takes on d7, the rook can take on e4 at the end of the line, so black is winning a pawn here, not good. So running it back a few moves, instead of taking the queen on b6, Pragg takes the knight on d5 here with the rook. And now we had queen to e6, so that square is now available because that bishop on d5 was eliminated. And now again, Pragg misses a great shot to actually try and get this knight back into the game. It's a big problem piece. So he could have taken here immediately. And after bishop captures, you go with the bishop first, not the knight, because otherwise your rook on b8 is hanging. Although that's still a theme of this whole line. We would have rook captures, knight takes, queen takes on b8, queen takes on b3, so this bishop is hit. And after, say, bishop d4, we could have a line like this where the knight takes on e4. So black is a pawn up here. It's a dangerous passed pawn, and I can see why Pragg didn't go in for this for that reason. But he does have some piece activity now. There are chances. These ones are a little bit muddled, as we can see. So he didn't go for this. I do understand why, because of that, being a pawn down. But at least he would have sorted this problem knight. Instead, Pragg doubled the rooks on the d-file, but now rook to a8 from Magnus. He gets out of these tactics and he prepares c4, undermining the protection of this knight, as we can see. So queen to c1 plays against that move, but this one is now critically weak, as we can see, and Magnus simply chops it off. Now, you could have taken here and taken the 2 minors for the rook, but again, after rook e to d8, very simple move, black can actually take back the d-file, and although you've got a rook for 2 minor pieces, which at times can be bad, in this position it's good for black, because these 2 pawns, the 2-on-1 here, give Magnus the chance of creating a passed pawn later, and you still have a problem of getting this knight into the game. So coming back here, after the queen took on e4, Pragg didn't go in for this move. Instead, he played pawn to h3, giving some luft for the back rank. Now rook to a7 from Magnus, so he shuts off this idea altogether. And queen d2 from Pragg. So what he's doing with this move is holding the rook on d5, so that now he's threatening rook to e1, skewering the queen to the rook, so that after the queen moves away, he would pick up the rook. If you tried that on the last move, then black would have been able to take the rook on d5. So now that's a threat. Magnus goes queen to g6. And Pragg does get knight h4, queen moves, knight f5 here, which is often worth a pawn. But in this position, this knight is still a critical problem. And so it doesn't actually allow for the fact that you've got a knight to f5. And now the players are both in big time trouble. Best here for black is actually developing the bishop to b7. But what you have to see is that after you lose the knight here, you can take this one here. So you're doing well. But okay, it's difficult to see this. The time's really low. Instead, Magnus plays c4, undermining this knight. Looks very logical. And now Prague's last chance here was to take on g7 with the bishop. Because after capture's back, knight takes, king takes, now you have some tactics and some attack against the king. Now you don't check on d4 immediately to pick up this unprotected rook. Reason being, if black plays knight f6 now to block, and you take here, well black takes here and this is no good. And coming back here, if you try rook d6, well queen e7 is adequate to just defend that knight. And I mention rook d6 because it's a key theme in the position here. If we just run back a move to here, instead of checking here first, rook d6 is the move. Strong move, because after the queen moves away, let's say it goes to e7 in this position, now you don't check because you have the same defense, but you take here with check. The king moves back, and something like rook 6 to d4 is very strong, looking to create mating threats against the black king. Now black is still technically better after knight f8 here to come to g6, but you know, crazy position, big chances for Prague there, especially in time pressure. But okay, he missed to play like this. He didn't take on g7, he's playing the world champion, pressure's on. Instead, after pawn to c4, he plays queen d4 immediately, hitting this rook, but now Magnus solves all his problems with knight to f6. If you take here, same problem, we just take on d5. So knight to b6 was played by Prague, getting that knight out finally, giving an exchange if Magnus wants it, but first Magnus chucks in c3, blunting that bishop. Loads of problems for Prague now. If he drops it back to c1, well, we can simply take on d5, excellent position. So instead Prague tries taking here on c8, also hitting this rook, but now Magnus plays queen takes on d5. He also could have gone with the knight, but this forces the queens off. This knight is also attacked. So we had takes, knight takes, Prague took the rook on a7, but pawn takes on b2. And this pawn is going through now, you just can't stop it. So the rook came to b1, there's a threat here to come knight c3. And now rook e2 from Magnus holds the pawn and threatens knight to c3. There's nothing that Prague can actually do about that, so he threw in the towel here. If you enjoyed this video, then do hit here to subscribe to the channel and see another amazing Tata Steel game, click here. Thanks very much for watching and see you soon.